The fire had not yet finished with the papers when the room exhaled its collective shock. Eleanor Vance stood frozen at the edge of the drawing room, watching orange tongues curl around the parchment that had been, only seconds before, the legal instrument of her own erasure. The Duke of Ashcombe held the second copy in his bare hand, letting the flame creep toward his fingers before he dropped it, almost lazily, into the grate. "She is only my temporary wife," he had told them not 10 minutes earlier, his voice flat as a closed door, his pale eyes sweeping over the assembled lords and ladies of his circle with the particular contempt he reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. The words had cut through Eleanor like winter through wet wool. She had stood there in her borrowed finery, in the marriage that had been arranged to settle her father's debts, and she had felt the entire room's eyes catalogue her as something temporary, something disposable, a placeholder wife soon to be discarded. And then he had done the thing no one, least of all Eleanor, had expected. He had walked to the side table, lifted the divorce papers his own solicitor had drawn up at his mother's insistence, and set them alight before the eyes of everyone who mattered in London. The silence that followed was the kind that pressed against the eardrums. Lady Pemberton's teacup hovered, forgotten, halfway to her lips. The Dowager Duchess's fan stopped its idle motion, and Eleanor, who had spent 6 months bracing for the humiliation of being cast off, found herself staring instead at the back of her husband's head as he watched their supposed undoing curl into ash. To understand the violence of that single moment, one must go back to the spring when Eleanor Vance had still believed her life belonged to her. She had been the second daughter of a baronet whose love of cards had outpaced his love of solvency. Theirs had been a modest house in Hampshire, draughty in winter, fragrant with lavender in the summer months, and entirely, catastrophically mortgaged by the time Eleanor turned 21. Her elder sister, Margaret, had married well and married early, securing herself a comfortable life and in the process securing nothing at all for Eleanor, who remained behind with their ailing mother and their father's mounting creditors. Eleanor had not dreamed of dukes. She had dreamed modestly of a quiet cottage, perhaps a husband who read poetry aloud in the evenings, perhaps children who would not inherit her father's recklessness. She had not dreamed of being summoned to her father's study on a grey Tuesday afternoon to learn that the Duke of Ashcombe required a wife, urgently, discreetly, and without sentiment, and that her father had offered her hand in exchange for the clearing of her debts. She had wept that night, not from heartbreak, for she did not know the Duke well enough to mourn losing him, but from the particular grief of discovering one's own life had been spent like currency. The Duke himself, Julian Ashcombe, was a man the gossip columns adored and feared in equal measure. He had inherited his title at 23, following his father's sudden death, and spent the subsequent years building a reputation for icy composure that bordered on cruelty. He smiled rarely, he spoke even more rarely, and when he did, his words tended to land like stones dropped into still water, small, precise, and capable of disturbing everything beneath the surface. Society had collectively decided that the Duke possessed no heart at all, only a meticulously tailored coat where one ought to have been. What society did not know, what only Julian himself understood in the locked room of his own chest, was that he required a wife not for love, nor even for an heir, but to silence a particular cousin who stood to inherit the dukedom should Julian remain unmarried past his 30th birthday, a date now alarmingly close. The cousin, Reginald Ashcombe Hale, was a man of considerable charm and considerably less scruple, and Julian trusted him about as far as he trusted a viper sunning itself on a garden wall. A wife, any wife, would close that door. Julian had resolved, with the same cold efficiency he applied to his estate ledgers, that the marriage would be temporary in spirit if not in law, a contract, a shield, nothing more. He had chosen Eleanor specifically because her family's desperation meant no one would ask inconvenient questions, and because, in the one brief meeting arranged to finalize the match, she had looked at him not with calculation, as so many debutantes did, but with a kind of weary, unguarded honesty that he found he could not stop thinking about. He told himself this meant nothing. Their wedding had been small, swift, and utterly without warmth. Eleanor had worn her sister's altered gown. Julian had worn the expression of a man attending a tedious business meeting. The vows had been spoken in a chapel half lit by grey morning light, and when the ceremony concluded, the Duke had offered his wife his arm with the same detached courtesy he might extend to a stranger he was assisting across a muddy street. In the months that followed, Eleanor learned the architecture of her husband's silences. She learned that he took his coffee black and his solitude even blacker, retreating most evenings to his study with the door firmly shut. She learned that the staff adored him in a way that Tun would never have guessed, that he settled their wages personally and remembered the names of their children. She learned slowly and against her own better judgment that beneath the ice there was a man who had simply never been given reason to believe warmth was safe. And she learned, too, the particular cruelty of his circle, the friends and relations who came to dine at Ashcombe House and treated her consistently as an inconvenience to be tolerated. Lady Pemberton's barbed compliments about Eleanor's humble origins, the Dowager Duchess's habit of speaking about Eleanor as though she were not in the room, discussing how soon this unfortunate arrangement might be dissolved, Reginald's oily insinuations, delivered with a smile, that Eleanor ought not grow too attached to her position, as duchesses, in his experience, were rather more interchangeable than people liked to admit. Eleanor bore it because she had nowhere else to bear it. She wrote letters to her mother that she never sent, full of complaints she was too proud to voice aloud. She walked the gardens of Ashcombe House in the early mornings when the dew still clung to the roses, and allowed herself in those private hours to grieve the life she had not chosen. She did not know that Julian watched her from his study window during those walks. She did not know that he had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to arrange his mornings around the hope of seeing her cross the lawn. She did not know that the coldness he wore like armor in public had begun, in her presence alone, to feel less like protection and more like a prison of his own making. It was Reginald who forced the crisis. Sensing that the marriage remained, in his estimation, a fragile and temporary arrangement, he had gone behind Julian's back to the Dowager Duchess and convinced her that the kindest thing, the most practical thing, would be to draw up divorce papers quietly, to have them ready the moment Julian's 30th birthday passed and the legal necessity of the marriage expired. The Dowager, who loved her son fiercely, but understood his coldness as a permanent condition rather than a wound waiting to heal, had agreed. The papers had been drawn, and in a moment of staggering carelessness they had been presented to Julian publicly, in front of his assembled circle, as though offering him a gift, his freedom, wrapped in legal parchment, ready for his signature. It was in that charged atmosphere, Reginald smiling his serpent smile, the Dowager looking expectant, Lady Pemberton already composing the gossip she would spread by morning, that Julian had spoken the words that shattered Eleanor where she stood. "She is only my temporary wife." He had said it not to wound her, though it wounded her all the same. He had said it because he understood with sudden and terrible clarity that Reginald had engineered this moment specifically to extract a public confirmation, to hear Julian dismiss Eleanor with his own mouth, so that no one, least of all Julian himself, could later claim the marriage had been anything but a contract. He had said it as a man backed into a corner says the thing he believes is expected of him, even as something in his chest recoiled at the sound of his own voice. And then he had looked at Eleanor's face. He saw the precise moment the words landed, saw her spine straighten, not in defiance, but in the particular bracing of someone absorbing a blow they had long expected and dreaded all the same. saw the flicker behind her eyes, gone almost before it arrived, of something that might have been hope dying. She did not cry. She did not flee the room. She simply went very still, the way wounded things go still, conserving what strength remained. It was that stillness that undid him. Julian Ashcombe, who had spent 8 years constructing a self that needed no one, who had buried every soft instinct beneath layers of duty and distance, felt something inside his chest crack open like ice, giving way beneath spring thaw. He understood in that single suspended second that he had just done the cruelest thing he had ever done to another human being, and that he had done it to protect a lie he no longer believed. He crossed the room. He took the papers from the side table where Reginald had so triumphantly placed them. He did not look at his cousin. He did not look at his mother. He held Eleanor's gaze, and only Eleanor's, as he carried the papers to the fire. "I misspoke," he said, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, though every ear in the room strained toward it. "She is not temporary. She is my wife. She has always been my wife, in every sense that matters, and I have been a coward and a fool for taking this long to say so." The fire took the papers eagerly, the way fire takes anything offered to it without resistance. Reginald's composure cracked first, his charming mask slipping into something uglier, more desperate. "Julian, be reasonable. The arrangement was always meant to be temporary. You said so yourself, not a quarter hour." "I know what I said." Julian's voice, when he turned it on his cousin, carried none of the warmth he had just shown Eleanor. It was the voice of the Duke society feared, restored in an instant, sharpened now to a purpose. "I know why you wish to hear me say it. You have spent 2 years circling this house like a man waiting for a death, Reginald, and I am finished pretending I do not see it. There will be no divorce. There will be no vacancy for you to inherit, and after tonight you will find yourself considerably less welcome beneath this roof." The Dowager Duchess, pale and visibly shaken by the realization of how thoroughly she had been maneuvered by her nephew's ambitions, opened her mouth to speak, and then, for the first time in her formidable life, found she had nothing adequate to say. Lady Pemberton's earlier barbed comments about Eleanor's humble origins curdled into something she would spend considerable effort pretending she had never said, as it became swiftly, mortifyingly clear that the Duchess of Ashcombe was not a temporary inconvenience to be managed, but a woman whose husband had just declared before the whole of his circle that he would burn the world before he let her go. Julian turned from the dying fire and crossed the room to where Eleanor still stood, her composure beginning at last to fracture into something raw. "You did not have to say that," she whispered when he stood close enough that only she could hear him. "You did not have to humiliate yourself for my sake." "I did not say it for your sake alone," he answered, and for the first time since she had known him, his pale eyes were not cold at all, but lit with something that looked dangerously close to fear, the fear of a man who has only just understood what he stands to lose. The room around them seemed to recede, the way a candlelit room does when its occupants stop breathing in unison. In the days that followed, the consequences arranged themselves with the swift, merciless efficiency of high society correcting its own course. Reginald Ashcombe Hale found his invitations quietly withdrawn from every house that mattered, his creditors suddenly less patient, his charm no longer sufficient currency to cover the debts of his ambition. Within a fortnight, he had removed himself to the continent, where his particular talents for flattery and manipulation would have to be exercised on an audience that did not yet know better. The Dowager Duchess, pale and humbled by her own complicity toward the daughter-in-law she had so carelessly dismissed, undertook a long and quiet penance of genuine kindness toward the daughter-in-law she had so carelessly dismissed, and in time the two women discovered, somewhat to their mutual surprise, an affection neither had thought possible.
Lady Pemberton learned the precise cost of underestimating a woman who might one day hold considerable influence over the very drawing rooms in which her reputation was made or unmade, and adjusted her opinions accordingly with the swiftness of the truly self-interested.
And Julian Ashcombe, the Duke whom London had long ago decided possessed no heart at all, spent the remainder of that autumn proving the entire ton magnificently wrong. He walked the gardens each morning beside his wife, rather than watching her from behind glass. He read to her in the evenings, not poetry exactly, for he had never possessed Eleanor's gentle taste for verse, but his father's old letters, his mother's early diaries, the private history of a family that had never before let her past its locked doors. He learned, slowly, and with the same diligence he had once reserved for ledgers, the particular architecture of his wife's own silences, and found beneath them not weariness, but a courage that humbled him. Eleanor, for her part, came to understand that the ice she had once feared had never been cruelty at all, but the brittle shell of a man who had been taught, far too young, that warmth was a weakness the world would exploit. She did not forgive him quickly for the words spoken before the fire, but she watched him unmake himself, piece by careful piece, in the months that followed, and found that forgiveness, once it arrived not as a single decision, but as 100 small mornings spent walking beside him in the garden, neither of them temporary any longer, neither of them alone. Years later, when their own daughter asked how their parents had fallen in love, Eleanor would tell her only that some vows are not spoken in chapels at all, but in firelight, when a man finally burns away every lie he has told himself and chooses at last the truth he had been too frightened to claim.